Hello everyone, welcome back to the Introduction to Watercolor class. The focus of this video will be complementary colors. In this demonstration, I'm going to be using a set of complementary colors to create a simple still life in watercolor. Previously I said there are three pairs of colors that are most often referred to by artists as complementary colors. These are yellow and violet, red and green, and blue and orange. There are several reasons for limiting ourselves to two complementary colors in a painting. For beginning painters, it helps them to limit the number of decisions they have to make. It can also help you understand how to use warm and cool colors, mix neutral colors, and focus on accurate values in watercolor painting. Additionally, these color pairs are observable in nature. Early Impressionist painters understood this as well. They observed that sunlight can have a different color or temperature depending on time of day, atmospheric conditions, or even seasons. Depending on these factors, sunlight could be yellow, orange, or red. So these warm colors could be found in areas of light in a landscape or on objects. In those areas of shadow where light was being blocked, they could see that warm colors opposite or complement in the shadow, like violet, blue, or even green. Finally, many artists use complementary colors in an entire painting or even just in sections of a painting because it makes those colors stand out. It can make a painting more dynamic and interesting. In this demo, I'm going to be using the complements of yellow and violet to paint a simple still life. My still life is made up of two simple objects, an egg and a folded paper object. In this case, I made a paper boat, which is one of the only things I know how to make. The reason I selected these two objects is that the egg is a rounded surface, kind of like painting a sphere, and we did that in a previous lesson. And we have those same value structures that a sphere has. The reason for the paper object is that it has flat surfaces and corners, much like a cube or a pyramid. Form shadows that are found on structures like this are called planar values. These are value changes that we see on flat surfaces. If you're doing this for a project, you can either create your own still life with an egg and your own folded paper object, or you can simply look at this photo as your source. Let's get started. I'm going to begin with a contour line drawing in pencil. I'm starting with the egg. I lightly sketch in that oval sort of shape of the egg. Then I use a bit more pressure and I emphasize the correct edges of that egg. The composition should be life-sized or larger and centered relatively well on your paper. When you begin your line drawing, think about where you are starting in relation to the overall still life and how that might fit on your paper. I then lightly sketch in the edges of the cast shadow. For the paper object, I really try to focus on the angles that those planes make with the egg. I lightly sketch in those straight lines that are overlapped by the side of the egg. I think about the distance between the corners of the object and the egg, and I try to plot a few of those on my drawing. Then I lightly draw straight lines that connect to these various corners and points. After it's lightly sketched in, I use a bit more pressure and I emphasize those correct lines within that sketch. Now it's time to paint. I'm using two brushes today, one to paint with and the other to soften edges with. You may remember from previous videos that to soften an edge, I need a clean, semi-wet brush. So I clean my brush off, dab it on a sponge, or just wring it out with my fingers before I soften edges. Now it's time to mix my paints. I'm only using yellow and violet for this painting, but I'm going to need to mix those two together for some of my shadow and neutral colors. I'm starting with a puddle of yellow. Now I mix yellow and violet together to make a neutral color. I'll use this color for my form shadows. Next, I mix a puddle of violet only for my cast shadows and for areas of reflected light. Last, I use yellow and violet mixed with little or less water to create a very dark neutral. This I'm going to use for my very darkest shadow areas. I sampled each of these colors on a piece of test paper to make sure they're accurate. Now it's time to paint. I take the yellow first, and I go around and reserve an area of white paper for the highlight of the egg, a circular area to the upper left. I paint the egg about halfway across, and now I soften the edges of that highlight with my other brush. I want to create a nice hazy or smooth transition between the highlight and the area of light. Now while that paint is still wet, I take my neutral color, which is my second darkest color, and I fill in the rest of the egg, except I leave just a little bit of white paper toward the bottom. That will be the area of reflected light. In that transition area between the yellow and my neutral color, I let those colors bleed together while it's wet, and I use my brush to blend them together just a little. Now I'm going to take my violet and dab it into that area of reflected light. That creates a nice, warm, cool contrast between the area of light and the area of reflected light and shadow. While that's still wet, I take my darkest neutral color and I dab it into the area of the core shadow. That gives the egg this appearance of roundness. I just let those colors sort of bleed together a little to create a smooth transition. And now I'm going to dry them off. I'll use my heat gun to speed up the drying time. Again, if you have a hair dryer at home, that'll work just as well. Now I'm going to paint the paper object. The little point or top of that boat is a plane or a flat surface of value. I'll start with yellow and fill in most of that plane or area of value. Then I dab in a little bit of my lightest neutral color toward the top of that area of value, where it's just a little bit darker. And then I let it bleed into the yellow. I notice toward the bottom of that area it tends to get cooler, so I dab some of my violet toward the very bottom of that section. And I'll use that same method for each of these sections. There's a small fold of paper on the right side of that boat that I see where I see a transition from yellow to neutral. So I'm just painting in each of these surfaces one section at a time. Looking for areas of dark and light, using my yellow and then my lightest neutral tone to fill in areas of light and shadow. I'm also being careful to leave little highlight areas between each of these sections of value that I see on the edges of the folded paper. I can just leave that white. On the left side of that boat, that area that's in shadow, I notice it goes from very dark up at that point to lighter as it goes down toward the bottom. So I create a gradated wash. And then dab in some of my darker color into the point of that boat. I paint in each of these sections or planes of value separately. For each one, I determine whether it goes from light to dark or warm to cool. And I paint those colors in together and let them bleed together within that section. In areas that are down toward the bottom of the boat, I notice reflected light. In those reflected light areas, I paint in some of the pure violet. Just make sure that you allow time to dry before painting in another section of the boat that's connected to an area you've just painted. Otherwise, those colors will bleed together. Now I'm going to dry off the paper object. I decide to take my darkest neutral color and emphasize some of the darkest form shadows on that paper object. I look for edges or corners where it's very dark, and then soften the edge and blend it into the rest of that area of value. I give that time to dry again. Now it's time to work on the cast shadows. I start with the cast shadow of the paper boat, and I fill in that area between it and the egg with violet. And I want to carefully go around the edges of that egg to keep that round edge. Now I take my clean brush and I soften the edges of that cast shadow. Remember, cast shadows tend to be softer and fainter the further they are away from the object. Then I take the violet and I paint in that second section of the cast shadow that's up above the egg. It's really a wedge or triangular shape. And then I take my clean brush and I soften the edge of that shadow, especially toward the point of that shadow shape, that wedge shape. I soften it several times along that outer edge of that cast shadow so it really looks like it fades away. While these cast shadows are still wet, I take my very darkest neutral tone and I dab some of that in right along the edge and bottom of that boat so that the cast shadow is darkest right up next to that paper object. I just let that color bleed into the violet. While that is drying, I move on to the cast shadow of the egg. Again, I take violet, carefully fill in along the bottom edge of the egg, and then paint in that area of the cast shadow. Now I soften that edge so that it fades and becomes more blurry as it moves away from the egg. I do that several times to really drag that color out, to really fade that color out. Now I take my darkest neutral color and dab some of that in while the cast shadow is still wet, right along the bottom edge of that egg. And I just let that color bleed into the rest of the cast shadow. I take my darkest color and I dab it in a little bit more, right next to each object within the cast shadow, just to emphasize that. That painting is completed. I think it's got a convincing look of light and shadow through the values and the use of warm and cool color in that set of complements. And I really like the contrast in color between the yellow and the violet. It really makes it jump out of the page. One thing I noticed, however, is a little mistake I made on that right corner of that paper boat. You can see I kind of made a mess there. I can be a slob at times. So I'll just show you how you can fix something like that. To clean off that area, I'm going to let it totally dry first. After it's completely dry, and I can use my heat gun or a hairdryer to do that, I take a fine grade of sandpaper and fold it up into a small square. And then using it like an eraser, I just keep sanding over that area until eventually it's erased, and then brush it away. That's one technique you can use to fix mistakes if you make some mistakes on a painting. You can use any of those three combinations of complementary colors for this painting. I like the look of the yellow and violet here, but I also completed one using blue and orange. You can see that this creates an interesting effect of light and shadow as well by using the warm and cool combination of those complementary colors. That's all for today. I'll see you next time in Introduction to Watercolor.